Louisiana, 1944. Heat hangs heavy over the POW camp, the kind that clings to the skin and smells faintly of rust and cotton. A wooden table stands between men who had once aimed rifles at each other. On one side, an American guard empties a paper sack. Dozens of round candies tumble out, their bright colors scattering like glass marbles. The sound of sugar hitting metal breaks the silence. Sunlight cuts through the barracks window. A beam strikes one candy that rolls to the edge of the table. Through its hollow center, light passes cleanly, forming a thin ring on the wall, a perfect circle of gold. A German officer, uniform faded but posture still stiff, lets out a short, cold laugh. "Lifesavers," he says, tasting the word like something sour. "Americans think sugar can save lives." His comrades snicker, the laughter sharp, nervous, trying to hide hunger behind arrogance. One taps the table with a finger. Maybe they believe sweetness wins wars. The air fills with the brittle sound of mockery. The American, a young private from Illinois named Tom Miller, doesn't reply. He's seen enough faces like theirs before, proud, tired, pretending not to be broken. He pushes the sack closer to them, picks one candy, and pockets it. Then, as he turns to leave, he sets a single green mint on the window ledge. Outside, cicadas hum inside. Silence stretches. The candy catches the afternoon light, glowing like a small lantern above the prisoner's shadows. The Germans stare without speaking. It isn't laughter now, but confusion, a quiet that feels heavier than any insult. One of them, Corporal Franz Lenz, had once marched through Kharkov, past the bodies of men who starved in snow. He looks at the glimmering candy and mutters, half to himself, "We joked about saving lives, but maybe they meant it." The others ignore him, yet their eyes return, again and again, to that soft glow. By dusk, the air cools. The candy melts slightly under the window heat, forming a sticky ring of sugar. The light it casts fades, but the circle remains a mark of something they can't name yet. It is a small thing, a child's treat, a piece of color in a world drained gray by war. But in this camp, far from the shattered cities of Europe, even a circle of sweetness can split pride open. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Across the ocean, Europe starved. Children in Hamburg licked empty jam jars. Mothers in Warsaw boiled potato peels to quiet the night's hunger. But in America, sweetness was a language of endurance. Even as the war consumed steel, oil, and men, sugar flowed into tins, boxes, and rolls. And inside nearly every soldier's ration kit was a tiny comfort, a roll of Lifesavers. They were born in Port Chester, New York, at the Lifesavers Manufacturing Company. By 1943, the factory ran 24 hours a day, powered by women and teenagers whose brothers fought overseas. The numbers were staggering, over 23 million rolls each month, each packed with precision, labeled for troop morale in an age of rations, when butter, coffee, and tires were limited. Candy remained a promise that not everything sweet had been lost. American GIs carried them in their pockets, handed them to children in Italy, and tucked them into letters home. A soldier in the 36th Infantry wrote to his sister, "They taste like peace, even in mud." It was no small thing, a single circle of sugar that made the war feel human for one more hour. In Camp Ruston, Louisiana, word spread quickly among prisoners. The Americans gave candy to everyone, even black soldiers, even Italians, even the Germans who had bombed their ships. To men raised in a world that divided pure and inferior, the sight of shared sweetness was disorienting. One SS sergeant whispered, "They use candy as propaganda." But another replied, "If it is, it works." During breaks from labor, guards sat with the prisoners under the tin shade, chewing the hard candy slowly so it would last. The sound of sugar cracking between teeth replaced the sound of gunfire that once filled their lives. At night, the faint scent of peppermint drifted across the barracks. It mixed with the smell of wet uniforms and dust. A few prisoners, unwilling to admit curiosity, began to trade bread for candy. Some said it eased thirst. Others said it made them dream of home. America, they realized, was fighting a different kind of war, one of symbols, comforts, and contradictions. In a world of bullets and bayonets, something as small as a circle of sweetness became a weapon of memory. The irony was sharp men who had once laughed at candy were now letting it rest on their tongues like a relic. They still didn't understand the name printed on the wrapper Lifesavers, but they would soon. That night, rain beat softly against the barracks roof, steady as a metronome. The men lay on thin cots, staring into the dark. Somewhere near the door, a candy wrapper crinkled. No one spoke. Then came the small click of a tooth against sugar. Corporal Franz Lenz, the same man who had mocked the candy that afternoon, turned the roll in his hand. One mint remained, white and perfect. He hesitated, then bit. The sharp coolness spread down his dry throat, shocking in its simplicity. For the first time in months, something tasted clean. He shut his eyes. The peppermint sting pulled him backward in time to 1938 Dresden, a Christmas evening before the war. His mother had pressed a small candy into his hand before church. "So you'll know," she said, "that even in the dark, something sweet still lives." He'd laughed then, embarrassed. He was 17, strong and impatient for the future. Now, under a foreign roof, her words returned like a whisper across years of death. Franz turned to his bunkmate, Otto Schultz, who was pretending to sleep. "It tastes like home," he murmured. Otto didn't reply, but his fingers twitched, as if reaching for one, across the room. Another man began to hum a hymn, the kind sung softly in churches, before war turned them to rubble. The melody drifted between bunks, fragile and low. Outside, lightning flashed over the Louisiana fields. For a moment, the barracks glowed in a pale shimmer, and the faces of men who had once shouted Sieg Heil looked almost childlike. The peppermint dissolved slowly, and with it, a layer of pride. In a letter found decades later in the German archives, Franz wrote, "It was only candy, yet it made me remember that I once had a mother, that I once prayed." That confession brief, human, unguarded, revealed something the war never taught: the difference between obedience and feeling. By midnight, the rain eased. One guard peeked in and saw them lying quietly. No arguments, no defiance. Only the faint scent of mint lingered. It was as if laughter had melted, drop by drop, into silence. Outside, frogs croaked near puddles. Inside, peace settled like dust. A circle of sugar had done what sermons and slogans could not. It had reminded men of warmth. Private Tom Miller was 22. From a small town in Ohio where his family ran a hardware store beside a single-screen theater. Before enlisting, he had never traveled farther than Cincinnati. Now he found himself guarding men who once carried the world's most feared insignia. He didn't hate them. He didn't trust them either, but he pitied their hunger. Every morning, before inspection, Tom slipped a few Lifesavers into his breast pocket. It wasn't part of regulation, but it became his ritual. When the prisoners lined up for breakfast oatmeal, bread, weak coffee, he would leave one candy on the tin table. The men never thanked him, yet none dared throw it away. One afternoon, while the Louisiana air shimmered with heat, a translator named Sergeant Weber approached. He had studied at Columbia before the war and now served as interpreter between captors and captured. A German lieutenant, pale and lean, had asked him to convey a question. "Why does the guard give candy every day to mock us?" Tom leaned against the post, took off his cap, and smiled faintly. "No," he said, "to remind you what life tastes like." The translator repeated it in German. The lieutenant blinked, his jaw tightening. Then, without another word, he turned away. But later that night, someone placed the empty candy wrapper on Tom's bunk rail, folded neatly like a note of truce. A week later, Tom was reassigned to escort prisoners to a local farm as they loaded hay. He noticed one of them, the same lieutenant, sharing half of a Lifesaver with an older man who was coughing. No words, just a small gesture under the southern sun. That sight stayed with Tom longer than any medal he ever earned. In September 1944, an article in the Shreveport Times mentioned how POWs in Louisiana had adapted well, showing signs of discipline and mutual respect. It never mentioned candy, or Tom Miller, or the quiet acts that built invisible bridges. But history often forgets its gentlest soldiers. Back in his diary, Tom wrote a single line before mailing it home. "Some wars end when men remember sweetness." His mother never knew what he meant, but she kept that line pressed in a Bible until she died. Inside Camp Ruston, the laughter of derision had faded. Every small act a coin, a cigarette, a mint became a transaction of humanity. For men taught that mercy was weakness, it felt strange to be saved, even slightly, by sugar. The storm came without warning. Late September, 1944. The sky turned an iron gray, and wind tore through the pines around Camp Ruston. Within minutes, rain battered the barracks roof like stones, drowning the sounds of guards shouting orders. The floodlights blinked, flickered, then died. Darkness swept over the camp, sudden and absolute. Inside Barrack 12, panic flared. The German prisoners, already uneasy from the thunder, scrambled in the dark. Someone shouted that the roof was collapsing. A cot tipped over, metal clattering on the floor. In the confusion, one man tripped near the door, and something small rolled from his hand, a piece of candy. It struck the wet wood, spun once, and stopped. Lightning flashed for a single instant. Its light pierced through the candy's center hole, scattering a perfect ring onto the wall like a halo trapped in glass. "Licked, licked," someone cried. "Light." The men froze in that fragile shimmer. The barracks no longer felt like a cage. It was only a room full of frightened men sharing one breath. One of them, Private Gunther Adler, later wrote in his notebook, "We feared the ceiling would fall, but instead, a little thing on the floor reminded us we were still alive." When the storm's rage reached its peak, guards ran door to door with lanterns. The prisoners huddled together, Germans, Italians, even a Czech forced into the Wehrmacht, all staring at the tiny reflection still glinting on the wet floor. A lifeboat made of light. Outside, a tree split in two. Inside, the silence that followed was thick but calm. One man picked up the candy, placed it on the table, and whispered, "Lifesaver." The word felt foreign on his tongue, yet its meaning was clear. When dawn came, the camp lay drenched, fences sagged under the weight of water, boots squelched in mud, and blankets hung heavy. But there were no injuries, no chaos, only a quiet order restored. Later, when American engineers inspected the barracks, they found a damp piece of paper nailed near the door, a Lifesavers wrapper, smoothed and dried, pinned with a small nail. Beneath it, written in pencil, "Kein Spot mehr," no more mockery. Sometimes, wars are not ended by treaties, but by storms, the kind that leaves behind, in the puddles and mud. One circle of sugar that reflected light just long enough to remind men what hope looked like. Would you have seen that light, or missed it in fear? When morning broke, the camp smelled of wet wood and smoke from breakfast fires. The air was clean, almost gentle after the storm. The German prisoners gathered outside, hanging their soaked uniforms on fence posts, watching steam rise in thin white lines. No one spoke of the night's fear, but no one laughed at the candy anymore. Lieutenant Kurt Reiner, who had once led a panzer unit near El Alamein, found a damp paper stuck to the barrack wall. He peeled it off, flattened it against his knee, and saw the faded blue letters, "Lifesavers." The ink had bled from the rain, but the word remained. He turned it over and stared at the hollow ring printed on the back, that strange American symbol of eternity. He called to the translator. "What does it mean exactly, lifesaver?" "It means kumang, to save life," the man replied softly. Reiner nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "They have humor," he said, almost bitterly, but the bitterness faded before it reached his voice. He folded the wrapper and slipped it into his pocket, as if afraid to lose it. In the mess hall that day, a few men lined up early. The Americans handed out dry bread, apples, and coffee. At the end of the table sat a small bowl of Lifesavers. No one joked now. A prisoner named Ernst placed one in his mouth, looked at his reflection in the tin tray, and said quietly, "It saves something. Not life, perhaps, but memory." That afternoon, the guards noticed something different. The prisoners began to clean the yard without being ordered. They repaired fences, washed utensils, even helped carry firewood. A sergeant, puzzled, told his superior, "It's like they woke up new." But the change was not discipline, it was dignity rediscovered. When the Red Cross visited a month later, they noted an unusually cooperative atmosphere in the Louisiana camps. The report did not mention the candy. It never would. Yet diaries later found in Bremen and Munich repeated the same sentence. "Now we understand the name." Years later, Reiner wrote from Germany, I still have that wrapper. It was the first time I believed in life again." He never used the word lifesaver ironically after that. He said it the way a priest says, "Amen." Can a word carry mercy? Can a piece of sugar rewrite what war had burned away? Tell me if you had seen that faded wrapper. Would you have understood it too? Berlin, 1954. The city still bore its wounds, bullet holes on walls, hollow windows like eyes that had forgotten how to blink. Amid the gray rubble stood a small candy shop on Friedrichstrasse. Its sign, written in neat cursive, read "Süße Erinnerung, Sweet Memory." Inside, jars lined the counter, each filled with bright rings of American Lifesavers. Behind the counter was an old man with silver hair and a slow, steady smile, Lieutenant Kurt Reiner, now simply Herr Reiner, shopkeeper. He had returned from captivity with little more than a worn photograph of his mother and one fragile thing, that faded wrapper he had once folded in his pocket. It hung in a small frame near the register, next to a note in his own handwriting, sweetness once given by those we called enemies. Every afternoon, children came in with a few pfennigs. Reiner never rushed them. He'd hold up a candy to the sunlight, letting the beam pass through its clear center, forming a ring on the counter. See that he'd tell them, "That's the light that never breaks." One day, a boy with a torn school bag asked, "Opa, why is it called Lifesaver?" Reiner looked out the window at the gray street, at trams rumbling past, at a woman carrying bread wrapped in brown paper. Then he turned back, smiled gently, and said, "Because one day, long ago, it reminded me that I was still human. Outside, snow began to fall, light and patient. The reflection from the candy's hollow heart danced across the glass jars, scattering circles of color on the wall, red, yellow, green, white. For a moment, it seemed the entire shop glowed from within. Far away in Ohio, Tom Miller, older now, with children of his own, kept a small tin box in his drawer. Inside lay a photograph of Camp Ruston and a single Lifesaver, cracked but intact. He had never eaten it. Each year on Christmas Eve, he took it out, placed it by the window, and let the light pass through the hole. In that glow, two men, once enemies, now bound by a circle of sugar, lived quietly on opposite sides of an ocean, remembering that humanity sometimes hides in the smallest, sweetest things. Wars end in silence, but sweetness, once shared, outlives even bitterness. History often remembers the clash of nations, the speeches of generals, the treaties signed under chandeliers. Yet the quieter victories, the ones fought in hearts, are rarely recorded. Between 1943 and 1946, over 371,683 German prisoners of war lived on American soil. Scattered among more than 500 camps from Texas to Wisconsin, most came expecting vengeance. What they found instead was decency, sometimes clumsy, sometimes naive, but unmistakably human. A single roll of candy could not change ideology overnight, but it could startle a man long enough to question what he'd been taught. The taste of peppermint, the sight of shared labor between black workers and white soldiers, the laughter of American children playing outside the fences, these were lessons no pamphlet could teach. Lifesavers were meant for soldiers, for energy, for morale. Yet in those circles of sugar, a different message took form. The name, first a marketing choice, became a parable that life, when shared, even in its smallest pleasures, saves more than bodies, it saves belief itself. When those men returned home to the ruins of Europe, many carried the memory of sweetness as quietly as a medal. Some, like Lieutenant Reiner, turned it into a gesture of peace. Others wrote letters describing the shock of generosity, of discovering that mercy could be industrial, too produced in factories, wrapped in paper, handed freely. Tom Miller died in 1988, never knowing that his habit of leaving a single mint each morning would be remembered in diaries across an ocean. And yet, in a way, his kindness rippled farther than gunfire ever could. The circle of candy remains the perfect symbol. It has no beginning, no end, only light passing through emptiness. In war, that emptiness is vast, but once light enters, even through a hole of sugar, it refuses to leave. So perhaps the true story of Lifesavers is not about candy at all. It is about a simple truth rediscovered in a place of captivity, that salvation rarely arrives with flags or anthems. Sometimes it arrives quietly, dissolving on the tongue,